Welcome back to r/neighbors from hell, where people share stories about their crazy neighbors. And if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe to join our amazing community. And without any further ado, let's dive right into the stories. And the first one is titled, "Neighbor cut down 10-century-old trees and excavated my house's foundation without permission." I never would have imagined that the project my neighbors were working on could turn into such a mess. I live in an older and more mature neighborhood. Many of the houses and trees are over 100 years old, and we all like it that way. That is, until my neighbor decided that he would do something so drastic that it would end up nearly ruining my house. It all started one week when Dave, my neighbor, began the process of leveling and excavating some ground near the backside of our houses. I know that he mentioned a month or two ago that he was having a lot of issues with his basement leaking and sometimes even flooding when it rained for several days. I noticed that he was also having several trees from his yard removed. I found this to be a bad idea for his property value, but it was his house. Our backyards have a large footprint, but there is only a small part of it that is level with the house. The rest of the yard just drops off a pretty steep area where I have several very old trees and other ivy and foliage to cover the hill. Nearer to my house, I have a 130-year-old black walnut tree and a 110-year-old maple. I left one day to have my hair done and run a few other errands. That is when I received a phone call from my other neighbor saying that the excavation company had a backhoe practically in my house. I rushed home to find my yard in a state of devastation. They had ripped my entire yard all the way to my deck, all the way out. It was absolutely unbelievable. I literally cried the moment that I saw it. I called my husband Jeremy and sobbed, telling him what had happened, and he left work to see the damages immediately. I'm not exaggerating either, it was a hazard. It dropped about 12 feet from my back door down into this crazy ditch that they had created. Not only had they simply destroyed my entire yard, but they had taken out all of my trees. Every single one. Both of my 100-year-plus old trees and the 8 others that were easily over 90. The black walnut tree was close to my house, and the damage from them just yanking the tree out by the roots caused visible foundation issues immediately. I was already seeing cracks in my sidewalk, and it would not take an engineer to see the future problems I was about to have. At this point, my house was no longer safe. I was shouting for them to stop the excavation, which they did. I was ready to throw myself down in front of their machinery to put a halt to the project if I had to. I will never understand why the contractor or my neighbor would do what they did. While I knew that he was doing all of this to fix some issue he was having with his house, it felt as if it was a personal attack on me and my home. After the initial shock wore off, I stormed across the property to the men that were talking with my neighbor. Tears in my eyes, my face red with fury, I whirled my purse back to hit Dave, but my husband suddenly grabbed me. Probably for the better when I look back on it, but boy would it have felt good to just deck that guy. Jeremy began talking with them rather loudly. He was certainly upset as well. The lead contractor, I'm assuming, started saying that this was the only way he could fix Dave's basement issue, and that as they were excavating his side of the property, ours started falling away, so he went ahead and figured he might as well level our side as well. What a crock of BS if I ever heard it. Then Dave had the audacity to tell my husband that I asked him to have these trees removed while they were at it. My jaw dropped and I was quick to interject, telling them that this is false and I would have never asked him to destroy my yard or cut down my beautiful century-old trees. My husband had me step back again because he knows I will become hostile if they piss me off again. I promise, I'm normally a very kind person, but this was the craziest act of disrespect and assault on my personal property that I've ever dealt with. Our other neighbor across the street, Tony, came over and was checking with me while Jeremy and the others hashed out the situation. Tony used to own a construction company and did not hesitate to give me some helpful advice and assistance. Tony walked over to the group of men and began asking a few questions of his own. It became obvious that something was off. The head contractor was hesitant to show the permits that were required to do construction work. Tony brought up that they were supposed to be posted and available for anyone to see. The contractor said that he had them but had forgotten them at the office and therefore he had not posted them up. The group of workers and the contractor ended up leaving after the pressure from Tony, and Jeremy's questions seemed to become too much for them to explain. Prior to them leaving, my husband mentioned that he was going to look into the legalities of the situation and get back with them on how much money in damages they just caused. Their faces became pale as the men walked away. After a few days of investigating the entire situation, calling the city and finding out what kind of permits and other necessities there should have been to prevent damage to our property, we realized that Dave and his team of contractors were completely out of line on their work. He only had one permit for them to do work on the inside of the house in the basement and a permit for using the backhoe. No permit for the work they were doing outside or the digging that was going to be done. They also did not have the city or any professionals come out to flag where the plumbing, gas, water or electrical lines were. It's a miracle they did not do more damage than they did. It took me a matter of minutes to call and hire a lawyer after finding out this information. I had several friends that were once lawyers, so I was not short on recommendations. I explained what was going on and the attorney felt like we had a pretty sure fire case against them. Within the first week of this mess, we also started to notice that the house was having some cracks in the ceiling and tile in the kitchen nearest to the giant drop-off at the back of the home. We had to bring in an engineer and our own contractor to try and gather info on how much it would cost to fix the foundation problems that have been caused. We ended up getting quoted around $75,000 in potential damages, with a great likelihood that it will be more than that. We talked with our homeowner's insurance and they also recommended taking the company and neighbor to court for damages. The process was relatively quick for it being a legal issue. Court normally takes a long time. I used to be a clerk for 20 years before I retired. Our lawyer and the judge made short work of them when we laid out all of the details and proved how they were missing dozens of important steps and blatantly destroyed our property without permission or appropriate permits. Plus, it was not the neighbor's dang yard and that was his jurisdiction. The judge was honestly a little shocked at the situation and stated that no matter how they tried to put it, it is obvious that they were wrong to come and destroy my yard and cause so much damage to my house and destroy my trees. Thankfully, I had an arborist come before the court hearing because I did not realize how much they were actually worth. The black walnut was worth almost $60,000 and the maple was about $50,000. Plus all the other trees added up to about $130,000 as well, not to mention the damages to the home. All in all, dumb Dave and his even dumber contractor ended up shelling out over $350,000 to us. We required a lot of it to fix the home, ended up being almost $150,000 to repair the foundation issues and rebuild the yard. I even had a newer, mature tree planted which cost a pretty penny, but it was worth it. My home is still standing and Dave ended up moving. And yeah, ripe stars, I would say that is a very positive outcome for OP and I am very happy for her and the husband. If you enjoy the stories about just absolutely insane neighbors, then I would really appreciate it if you could post some star emojis in the comments if you want to support my channel. Thank you so much in advance, your support is very much appreciated. The next one is titled, "Don't Take My Car, Karen." So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He had started in the Marines but transitioned into the army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I will refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good if you can believe that. While they were talking, they see a young man enter the office and they immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned but I will call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began with telling her that he had just returned from deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood, not a good idea by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car, he had met the local girl who, for the sake of the story, I will call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she can take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of the place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he had found his room had been torn apart, all of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it had not been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially did not recognize, but as they got closer he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his conceal and carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this, I would assume yes, but even then Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her and Karen had a smile form on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it but was not aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they had met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently Morgan agreed and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was gonna call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they were not allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she would call her friends to finish the job if she did not get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security video. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence on her beating him up. She was arrested and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he did not want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Brock had a few more stories, but none of them were nearly as good as this one. And Ripe Stars, since we are veterans of Reddit, we already know you never mess with a Marine, or in general, you never mess with a soldier. I guess Morgan learned her lesson. And the next one is titled, "Don't Sue, we will let you come into our property to fix your sewer line." The house I grew up in was built on the side of a hill, great views, but the geography posed some challenges for the city utilities, sewage in particular. Their solution was to put all the houses on the hill in what was called a shared line. Essentially, one big pipe ran through all of our backyards just below the houses' basements. Effluent would flow out from the houses into the shared pipe and then down the hill to the city sewer line by the bottommost house. When we moved in, we were at the highest point that it was possible to build on and still be part of that shared sewer line. But a few years later, someone bought a lot just over the crest of the hill and linked up with ours without being part of the planned community that had an HOA that took care of the sewer line, among other things. And in fact, they did so without the HOA's approval. And so for the next 2 decades, my family would be the subject of near constant harassment over the state of the sewer. Their end of the line was lower than ours by just enough that it would stop flowing and clog, often backing up into their basement bathroom and shower. They would accuse us of diverting our effluent to their line because I guess we were some kind of plumbing wizards. Now, the reason nobody built a house on that part of the hill during the original development was that the soil was unstable, something hydrology related, and sure enough, over the years that house would occasionally separate from the hill and slide down a couple of inches. But our neighbors had connections in the code enforcement agency, so the place never got condemned like it should be. They just had to shore it up and reconnect all the utilities. The thing is, the further down the house moved, the steeper the negative incline was from their sewer connection to our junction box, making the clogs and backups even worse. At one point it got so bad that their sewer barely flowed. Some days it got completely clogged. Somehow this was our fault. They spent the next year calling us every time they tried to flush a toilet and crap came out in their downstairs shower. They called a plumber who said they had to redo their part of the shared line, and to do it they would have to bust through our 2-story masonry wall so they could get a backhoe onto our property and dig out the line. Of course we had issues with this. We said no, you will not come onto our property and tear it up with a big ass piece of construction equipment, hire human laborers or something. But instead they hired lawyers who started slinging paper around. According to them, we were in violation of state law that specifically gave an implied easement granting a homeowner access through another's property to maintain their own. So we hired lawyers of our own who said that we basically had a choice. We could win the case but pay a ton of money or just let it happen. Either way, we would be screwed. But they pointed out one important fact: that 20-year-old masonry wall was not in the greatest of shape anyway, so... A few months later we presented them with a bill for $75,000 for the rebuilding of the wall, installation of a new set of stairs, replacement of the entire wrought iron fence that had separated the two properties, resodding, replacement of ornamental plants and shrubs, and some minor repairs to our sewer, which they had borked up while relaying their pipes. I am not a general contractor, but my guess is that they could have hired pick and shovel labor to dig out that pipe and replace it with a new one for a fraction of that price, but no, they had to have a giant caterpillar tread machine do it. They balked, but then we handed them a Xerox copy of the letter that their lawyers had sent us with pursuant to paragraph blah 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 of the common code of blah blah blah, citing the next paragraph, which stated that the person using the easement was 100% responsible for any damage that might be caused. They still balked, but my parents put a lien on their property that stayed there to the day they tried to sell, at which point they had to pay up or the purchaser's creditors would not underwrite a mortgage. I think they had to pay interest too, but I am not 100% sure about that. Too long didn't read for the people who did not understand the story. Neighbors built their house to connect to our shared sewer line, house sagged down the hill, sewer broke, house filled with crap. They hired lawyers to force my dad to let them destroy our wall and backyard while repairing their sewer. We presented them with a bill for $75,000 to fix our yard. Got a brand new masonry wall essentially for free. And ripe stars, with this we have reached the end of the video. However, if you still cannot get enough of my content, then I would highly suggest to check out my endless binge watch playlist, which will soon show up in the left corner of the screen. In addition, I would really appreciate it if you could not only subscribe to the channel, but also turn on the bell notifications, which you can do by clicking on the little bell icon right next to the subscribe button. This will help my channel tremendously, and this will make sure that you don't miss any of my videos. Furthermore, if you want to see additional ripe content that I don't post on YouTube, then I would suggest to head on over to patreon.com/ripeyoutube for more than 50 exclusive videos that you will not see anywhere else. Thank you so much for your amazing daily support, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.